the war itself, and particularly I want you to think about the stage as the war is going to begin, how unlikely in many ways it is that the colonists are going to be able to win this conflict. They're dealing with a superior force in a lot of different ways, right? The British are going to have several advantages over these colonies becoming states as they, head to the field of battle. Yet they're also going to have some disadvantages, and I want to think about those as well as we think about kind of the creation of this imagined community. Right? Some of the advantages for the British, for example, are first they had the best trained army in the world. This is going to be a war. Right? It's good to have a larger, professional, um, well-trained army in this respect. That army is going to be fighting against largely farmers, right? Farmers that pick up their guns and decide to defend, their homes essentially. Um, so, on par, on paper, it's going to look like the British have every advantage in terms of this battle. As we know, though, when folks are defending their homes, they are particularly difficult to deal with. So this is going to be perhaps swing to an advantage for the Americans um, ultimately. Right. Second, Britain's population is about four times the size of the colonies at this point. So in terms of manpower, they have a lot more to draw upon than the colonists would have, four times greater in terms of population. Third, Britain has the most powerful navy in the world. So they're going to be able to use this navy effectively. Perhaps they think to literally stifle out this rebellion before it even becomes anything. Right? For example, cut off food supplies. The Navy had allowed Britain to do um, tremendous things around the globe in terms of its naval power, despite the fact that Great Britain is not that big. Right? It's ultimately going to control about a third of the globe, largely due to this Navy and its ability to use it. Most powerful Navy on earth at the time. Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't the colonies fighting against the world's best army?
Yeah, it could be argued that the French had some arguments about it. Especially when Napoleon gets going, their land force might be considered equal to or better than, according to some.
Happened after the revolution?
Yeah, he's really a sort of 1790s, 1800s kind of figure.
Before that, the British were the best army.
I think I would say that. Yeah, I would say that. There might be some that would argue, but I would say that. Yeah, definitely the best navy, far none, and probably the best army as well. It was professional. It was well trained. Now, part of the issue is war is changing, right? So they're well trained, but they're trained in traditional tactics, like standing right in front of you, fighting, guy on his knees and behind you, somebody behind them loading, and so it just keeps sort of rotating around that way. What they find is that they're shooting at colonists that are doing things like hopping out of the forest, shooting, hopping back in the forest, right? Kind of guerrilla tactics and war essentially changing. You hear a lot of British soldiers talk about these Americans are cowards. They won't just stand in front of us and fight like men. Colonists are like, what, are you stupid? Like, why would we do that? Colonists had learned a lot, for example, from some of the native conflicts they had. Natives hop out, fire off, disappear into the forest, and live to fight again, especially when you're outnumbered, right? So it's interesting that this is one of those moments when you see war changing and how that gets interpreted, right? The British interpret it as we're not really fighting men. They're not equal to us in a sense, but ultimately it's going to work.
So even though the British had the numbers, the colonists had the better strategy.
Yeah, I think you definitely could say that. Yeah, you definitely could say that. And this is often the case when you're fighting in your home turf, right? You know the land better than anybody else. You're fighting, literally, you can see your house. You're going to fight to the death, right, to protect family members and your way of life and whatnot. Whereas a professional soldier might be just fighting for a check. Well, you might just be fighting for that monthly paycheck. And what happens if you get killed? You don't get the paycheck anyway. So what is your incentive? Huh? Your family, yeah. True. If they had good benefits, true. But you're not going to have the same level of investment. And this is also true of that next term, the Hessian German mercenaries. These were soldiers paid by the British that were actually German. Right? So in terms of nationality and national loyalty and whatnot, they have no connection, right? It's all about this sort of check. How you doing? How you doing? So when you think about these advantages and disadvantages, you're right. They might be read in a few different ways, and it actually might be more complicated than it might appear on paper. Right? They say they always talk about this when they talk about football games. Right? Football games are not played on paper. If so, The Washington NFL team probably would have a few more wins. Making sure everybody's awake still. Making sure everybody's awake. Okay, so in terms of the advantages, it would seem that at least that Britain has the advantages going into the conflict, yet the colonists are going to have certain advantages and try to turn more of these things to their advantages as the war continues and drags on. Right, they would use these guerrilla tactics that are going to help them, that are not particularly well suited for the British to deal with this traditional style of fighting. These Hessian or German mercenaries prove less reliable than the British might want. Again, they're fighting for a check. They're not fighting for their king. Perhaps they're not as invested in the same way as a British soldier might be. With all that said, though, the early years of the war are bad for the colonists. It's sort of loss after loss for these early colonists. These years do not go well for the Americans. And there are going to be some reasons for that, not just individual soldiers, but really kind of structurally there are some problems, some difficulties of fighting this conflict. For example, the Continental Congress has to literally beg each state legislature for money to fight the war. Remember, there's not a strong central government at this place. There's no president at this point. Right? We're fighting this war under, it's going to be under the Articles of Confederation, which is a much more loosely organized system of government. It does not provide for things like direct taxation. And so in order to fight this war, Congress has to literally beg the states to contribute. You know, they write a letter, Virginia, please send $1,000. We need it right now. Virginia might be like, I don't got it right now. How about next Friday? So ultimately what happens is the soldiers are going to go without. Soldiers are going to really struggle to sort of fight this conflict. Soldiers write letters about not having shoes in the wintertime. Right? So there's some difficulties here financially, and a lot of it has to do perhaps with a larger structural issue as they're trying to finance this war. Congress is fairly successful at getting these states to contribute what they saw as their fair share. They asked for 1,000, Virginia might send them 500. Right? But what can you do? These things are not fully organized and coordinated as of yet. As a result, Washington's troops often go without pay, without key supplies, and they're going to struggle early on, in addition to having to deal with this professional army that the British send over. Right? The initial British strategy was to take over New York. The British feel like if they could take over New York, they can end this conflict relatively quickly for a couple of different reasons. One, New York has a large loyalist population. They feel like if they could take New York, they could kind of unleash this large population that still consider themselves loyal to the British crown. And geographically, if they could take New York, it would cut off rebellious New England from rebellious Virginia. They kind of cut them in half, cut off the supply lines in that sense. They think that they can end the war quickly this way, especially by dividing, the regions. They do take New York relatively quickly, with relative ease, and they're going to push Washington's army back into New Jersey. Washington learns a lot from these early battles in terms of retreating to survive, to fight another day. He loses more battles than he wins in this war, but he ultimately is going to win the war, in part by strategic withdrawals. So he would withdraw to New Jersey, kind of regroup, try to figure things out. And this is still in 1776, August of 1776, that he's forced to withdraw, retreat into New Jersey, only a month after the Declaration of Independence. Right? So the British are feeling fairly confident at this point that they're going to end this rebellion, as they called it, pretty quickly and pretty handily. The Americans would then retreat across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. They plan to spend the winter in Pennsylvania, and there are going to be a couple of difficult winters in Pennsylvania. You sort of hold up and wait for the weather to break so that you can continue the war, essentially. Thomas Paine actually wrote about the first winter in Pennsylvania. He says, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands now deserves love and thanks. So he says, look, if you're, a fair weather fan, basically, this is going to break you. But in essence, what he's trying to do is sort of galvanize folks to stick it out and last through the winter. Some think that the Army's going to desert during winter. A lot of soldiers want to go home. They want to go check on their families and their farms. They don't want to be holed up in Valley Forge all winter waiting and not knowing sort of what's going on back at home. And some soldiers do, in fact, desert, but most do not. Washington's army will remain intact. In fact, George Washington gets a lot of credit in this period for his sort of strength of personality and some moves that he would make in order to help keep the army together. For example, officers, especially Washington, as the highest officer, officers would often leave during the winter and go home themselves to sit in front of their warm fires. Right? Washington does not do so. He stays with his men, suffers essentially with his men, and this has a huge impact on them in terms of morale. They say, look, if this guy's going to stick it out, right? How can we possibly not do the same? And these types of moves are things that are going to endear him to his men. And ultimately, after the war, they may pay some dividends as well. He's going to be the unanimous choice as president, for example. So Washington deserves quite a bit of credit in this case for some of the moves that he would make. But he does know that he needs a win. Right? He knows that ultimately morale is based on getting some wins. He wants to deal at least one decisive blow to the British before winter really gets going. He says we need to get at least one win so we have some hope, some optimism moving forward into the new year. So Washington's troops would sort of sneak quietly across the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, and they launch a surprise attack against these Hessian or German mercenaries Christmas night that were essentially sleeping in Trenton, New Jersey. He catches them by surprise and is going to get this early victory at the Battle of Trenton. This is important. They at least know that they can win. At least know that they can win after several defeats. These and other smaller victories, though, are going to be short-lived. Again, Washington ultimately loses more battles than he wins, but he wins the war. He's going to win the biggest ones. The last one, he definitely is going to win, so this is important. After spending a winter in Princeton, New Jersey, the Continental armies met several major defeats during the spring and summer of 1777. Washington's second winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, is seen as disastrous. You're going to lose more people because of the winter than because of the battle. Difficult, these sub-freezing temperatures to go without proper clothing and proper food and shoes. Folks are going to suffer tremendously through this winter. However, one important battle in 1777 is seen as kind of a tipping point or a turning point in the conflict. Saratoga. Saratoga, New York, some see as perhaps the war's turning point in 1777 because it signals to other nations that we might have a fighting chance. France in particular. We're really trying to pull these other nations into the conflict as allies. Ben Franklin, for example, spent the entire war years in France, sort of, schmoozing with the French, trying to get them to join the war, getting them to help finance the war. And ultimately, the French are like, look, we don't know if you guys are going to win. We don't like Britain either, right? The French and the British have a long-standing feud, so they might have liked to join, but they don't want to join on the losing side. They want to join on the winning side. So Saratoga in 1777 is seen as an important tipping point. This victory in October 1777 would signal to France, Britain's chief rival at the time, that we might win, especially if they help. And the French decide to help the Americans openly beginning in 1778. This is going to change things. Right? Now, once France joins the conflict, not only do they send soldiers and generals and leaders, not only do they continue to help finance things, but this essentially becomes a world war. Britain and France are at war, and the New World, they're at war in the Old World as well. Britain now has to think about defending their Caribbean colonies from French attack, from the French Navy and French invasion. So it really broadens the conflict. It may thin out the British ranks in some important ways. It really is an important sort of move. I think also morale-wise, the Americans don't feel like they're alone in this. They have allies. Later, the Spanish, are going to be important as well, but not nearly as important as the French would be, fighting alongside them. In fact, by 1778. Again, this puts the British on the defensive. It may make them rethink some of their strategies, pulling back perhaps in some ways. Right? They're fighting not only in North America, but in the Caribbean and in Europe as well. Even with this decisive change, the war is going to drag on. 1779, 1780, the war will continue to drag on through these years. The British would try to consolidate their power, their strength, still trying to win, of course, but also trying to be perhaps a little more careful. Ultimately, they consolidate their troop strength in the South. Feel like if they can deal with Virginia, that they can still win the conflict. But by October 1781, we're going to see the beginning of the end. In October 1781, a large contingent of British troops are going to be forced to surrender at Yorktown, Virginia. They get trapped against the beach by colonial soldiers and by the French Navy. They're surrounded, essentially, and they're forced to surrender. Really, this is kind of the end, with the exception of a few kind of smaller skirmishes. This is really it in 1781. The British and Americans would begin peace negotiations. Those peace negotiations ultimately end up in the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, ending the war. All right, so there are several decisive kind of battles, several key tipping point moments, but ultimately I think the Saratoga is an important one, obviously, and Yorktown, obviously, where it ends, is an important one, leading to this Treaty of Paris that's going to be, in many ways, much more favorable than the Americans even thought. They're going to get more than they think coming out of this. They get their independence, obviously, but they're also going to get some additional land and things. Yet, this raises now an issue. It's one thing to make declarations about independence and what you would do if you were a free nation. Now, all of a sudden, you are. Now, all of a sudden, the theory is going to have to become practice. What is this new nation going to look like? How is it going to organize itself? How is it logistically going to do things different? Now, they had a sort of rough draft of a government that gets them through the war. The Articles of Confederation were that sort of rough draft. The Articles of Confederation have some successes, and you're going to see here in a second how they're going to have some failures as well that begin to make themselves apparent. But the Articles do successfully help to allow them to fight a war. Right? In 1777, the Continental Congress had adopted the Articles of Confederation. Although they're not formally ratified by the states until really the end of the war, 1781, they really have been the kind of rough draft, the blueprint. They really have been the working government of the young nation, the unofficial constitution of the country, you might say, during the war years. But there are going to be several problems with the Articles of Confederation that have already started to show themselves. Some of them we've already talked about. They created, quote unquote, the Articles created a loose, quote unquote, loose league of friendship between the states. They talked about a loose league of friendship between the states rather than a strong central government. Now, this sounds good, right? You want to have this nice friendship between the states. But without a stronger central government, without a president, for example, a sort of central authority, there are going to be some problems that arise. On one hand, you can understand why these folks would not want a strong central government. They just got finished fighting a war against a strong central government. They were colonies. They don't want somebody telling them what to do with absolute authority in this sense. So it makes sense that the Articles might have that kind of feel to them, right? Just creating a loose league of friendship between the states rather than sort of being beholden to them or some central government. But, like we said, the Congress did not have the power to levy direct taxes. This is going to be a problem. It was already a problem for, trying to fund the war effort. You can't make anyone pay. Many times the states would refuse. Many times states would send less money than requested. So all they could do was kind of request and, say please. and this is not necessarily going to work for running a country. Right? As we see, it led to Continental soldiers being underpaid, you know, poorly fed, clothed, these sorts of things. So that's one problem. Can't levy direct taxes. Secondly, the Articles did not give Congress enough power to sort of negotiate problems between the states. What happens if Virginia and Maryland have a border dispute? Who do they go to resolve that dispute? The Congress does not have enough power to regulate relations. As a result, there are border disputes. There are kind of trade wars that develop. States want to develop their own individual currency. And it's very difficult to sort of monitor all of these things and to control them. States are still very independent from one another. That shows in the fact that they're printing their own independent paper money in this period. That's going to lead to problems, economic and other problems. That's the second issue. Can't regulate issues between the states. Finally, the Articles of Confederation did not provide for a president or a chief executive, or for federal courts. They wanted to kind of minimize federal power at this point. So it already shows that there's going to be some tension between federal power and state power, tension that is going to remain even after this conflict. So those are three problems with the Articles of Confederation that people are already starting to realize are going to have to be addressed, going to have to be dealt with in some way. But while the war is happening, we talked about this when we talked about imagined community, right? When the moment of national crisis, you can kind of put these issues to the side, right? Everybody's working towards the same thing, winning the war, what have you. So while the war is on, many of the rivalries between the states, individual personality clashes or what have you are kind of kept in check, at least while the fighting continues. But now, once the war is over, national unity is going to become a serious concern. Without this common enemy, the states seem to have more differences than they did similarities. And these differences may start to emerge. Without a strong central government, these differences, these rivalries might threaten to destroy the new republic, before it really gains a foothold or before it really gets started. Right? Some of the issues would involve things like slavery, that are starting already to take on a regional kind of cast. And take you back to the research that you're starting to think about now. Despite these issues, there are some successes under the Articles. Right? We do win the war under the Articles. Right? The terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 are more generous than people had expected. For example, not only did Britain recognize American independence, they also ceded or gave up vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and Mississippi River. So not only would you get independence, you get land as a result of successfully winning this conflict. But already there's going to be some tensions there. You have to decide what are you going to do with this land? How is it going to look? How is the new nation going to organize itself? These problems start immediately, I would say. The Land Ordinance of 1785. The Land Ordinance of 1785, for example, contains provisions or rules for the creation of townships in the Northwest Territory, the area north of the Ohio River. So you already have some rules in place about how this land is going to be divided up, organized, and whatnot. Land Ordinance of 1785. The Northwest Ordinance in 1787 would lay out how states would eventually be created out of this territory. How is it, literally going to look? Start dividing it up, putting a ruler on the map, and physically carving out these states. But not only the shape of the states, what are these states going to look like? How are they going to organize themselves? What kind of rights would be guaranteed in them? Are they going to be slave or free? These are already questions that are being debated. The Northwest Ordinance, for example, guaranteed basic rights and forbade slavery. So you're not allowed to have slavery in this Northwest Territory. So you're already starting to see the creation of a kind of dividing line between North and South. One of the things central to that dividing line is going to be the idea of slavery, the institution of slavery. Between 1782 and 1786, all of the individual states that had made claims to parts of the Northwest Territory had given their lands or ceded their lands to the nation. So these states had claimed that territory. They kind of give up this claim so that the nation itself can, can move forward, essentially. So there are some successes under the Articles of Confederation, and there are some failures under the Articles. People are already thinking about changes that might need to be, amendments, essentially, that might need to be added to the Articles to make it workable. But pretty soon something's going to happen that maybe takes them a step further. This is one of the cartoons I told you I wanted to show you today. 1786, Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is going to happen in Massachusetts. In 1786, Shays' Rebellion happens in Western Mass, and it really is going to indicate some of the main problems, major problems, I should say, with the Articles of Confederation. Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran. He had fought bravely in the Revolution. Yet after the war, in the new nation, him and other small farmers like him, especially in Massachusetts, find that they are not benefiting in the way that they thought they would benefit from the war itself. So he's this veteran hero, but pretty quickly he's going to find himself dissatisfied with the situation. Him and other small farmers like him are losing their land, for example. In Massachusetts, the courts are literally foreclosing and taking small farmers' land. So if you had fought for all these years for freedom and independence, and you come back and you're going to lose your land, immediately what you'd start thinking, what have I fought for? What is it I really fought for? I was doing better under the British. So some are going to really start to question this, and Shays' Rebellion is going to be a major tipping point, in part because it indicates some of the main problems with the Articles of Confederation. Like many small farmers after the Revolution, Daniel Shays has fallen heavily into debt. You'll see some of that represented here. He's about to lose his farm to creditors. He's about to lose his farm. He and others in the community start to feel like the laws of Massachusetts are too much in favor of the banks and the creditors and the sort of elites, in a sense, that they're too pro-creditor. So you already have a kind of class division, perhaps maybe a geographical division too, Western Mass versus Boston and other areas. And these farmers are going to ultimately, from their perspective, defend themselves. They're going to ultimately defend themselves. One of the lessons from this, though, is that as they start attacking local courthouses, as they stop officials from foreclosing on people's farms, is that they're gaining momentum. He develops an army, essentially. This army marches towards the Springfield Armory. There's an armory, still the building is still in Springfield, Massachusetts. My mom is from Springfield, so I've seen it. But this is where the guns were kept. They're marching towards the Springfield Army to take it and get these guns, which would have made a much larger conflict. What they're seeing, though, is that there's no money to raise a militia to stop him. The bankers and the elites realize that the Articles of Confederation are not going to work because it doesn't even provide the funds to stop to get an army to stop this domestic disturbance. So ultimately, more and more people are going to realize that not only are the Articles of Confederation not going to work with small amendments, you need to throw them out and start over. Right? So Daniel Shays and his rebellion is really an important tipping point in all of this, and I think you'll enjoy some of this. Yes?
Why is it that when people are dissatisfied, they always start to rebellion?
Well, they felt like they weren't being heard. You're right. This displeasure at its extreme can lead to rebellion. Right? They feel like they're doing smaller steps before that, but those steps aren't being heard. When people feel like they're not heard, that's when you tend to see these major kind of cataclysmic kinds of change. Right? From their perspective, though, Daniel Shays felt like he was the true patriot. That he was really trying to gain freedom not just for himself but for everyone. So it's interesting how these things can be interpreted differently from one another. Take a look at least the beginning of this, and we'll see what you think about Mr. Shays' Rebellion. Plus, it's a cartoon. I promise you I'll show you a cartoon. door before I get in trouble for showing cartoons.
Dawn broke cold that day on January 25th, 1787. But the orange light did nothing to warm the frozen faces of over 1,000 men outside the federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. The group of farmers and ex-revolutionary soldiers knew that the ammunition they would need to march on Boston and overthrow the government was within their grasp. All that stood in their way were 900 militia troops. Captain Daniel Shays rode